Hi, we're just going to wait a few moments for other people to come into the webinar. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm Felicia Baca, and I'm the Executive Director of the Salt Lake City Arts Council. Welcome to the Utah Cultural Sector Community Update. A little bit of housekeeping first. If you are interested in closed captioning, click on the closed captioning button and you'll see add subtitles. And for question and answers, we'll have a question and answer section at the end of this discussion. You can add those at any time in the question and answer section, and we'll be filtering them to the moderator. Also, I want to thank our partners, the Utah Department of Heritage and Arts, the Utah Division of Arts and Museums, Utah Cultural Alliance, Utah Humanities, Utah Museums Association, and local arts agencies across the whole state. This call is going to run 90 minutes, and it's a conversation about systemic racism in Utah's cultural community. And it will be the first in an ongoing series about inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility in the arts. So the conversation is also sponsored by Muse Magazine, which is a biannual publication of the Utah Department of Heritage and Arts and the department's cultural partners statewide. An edited transcript of this will be published in the magazine's October 12th edition, which is available in the Sunday Deseret News, the Salt Lake Tribune, or by ordering it online. So before we get started, we're going to use some group agreements to set shared expectations for the spaces that we're occupying together today. We invite you to participate in this conversation with these agreements in mind and ensure the best possible experience for everybody, presenters and audience. Because of the difficult nature of engaging with topics such as these during the webinar, we encourage you to make space for the discomfort that may come with them and use these agreements to guide you for your experience when the discomfort might otherwise make it difficult to continue. Respecting each person regardless of how they identify, including their gender, sexuality, age, class, religion, beliefs, nation, physical, neurological, and cognitive identities. Recognizing that vulnerable interactions can and should occur, and creating space to acknowledge and discuss hurt, anger, or offense if it does. Acknowledging that there is value in discomfort in order to move forward. Speaking from your own perspective and avoiding making generalized claims or assumptions about others. Acknowledging racism is systemic. Prejudice is personal. Both are barriers to actual inclusion. Realizing our sector is not exempt from either racism or prejudice. Both must be addressed. Actively engaging in anti-racism and personal bias analysis is important work. And using the I statements. Honoring the knowledge and experience others share. No one knows everything, but together we know a lot. And acknowledging the experience and values that make each of us biased. Allowing others to help us check in with our biases in a respectful, productive way. Hold yourself and each other accountable with generosity and love. And acknowledging that we are all learning and may be at different places on our journeys. We will be patient with ourselves and others as we remain open to continued learning. And acknowledging the difference between intent and the impact of our words can sometimes be harmful, even when the intent is not. This work belongs to all of us, not just Black, Indigenous, people of color, or historically resilient communities. So I'll get to introducing our moderator and panelists today. Paisley Rekdal, the Utah Poet Laureate, is an English professor at the University of Utah and the guest editor of Best American Poetry 2020. Earlier this year, she launched the Mapping Literary Utah website, and her forthcoming book, of nonfiction, Appropriate, a Provocation, is available on pre-order, and it tackles the thorny debate around cultural appropriation and the literary imagination. Our first panelist is Willie Palomo, the son of an El Salvadorian immigrant. He earned a master's degree in Latin America and Caribbean Studies and an MFA in poetry from Indiana University. He is a poet, educator, and organizer and translator, and he's the literary program manager for Utah Humanities, and previously was the coordinator for Southern Utah University's Center for Diversity and Inclusion. Dee-Dee Darby-Duffin is a singer and actor, and she's the 2020 Utah Arts and Museum's Performing Arts Fellow. She has acted at a wide variety of Utah theaters, including earning acclaim in the lead role in productions Lady Day at Emerson's Bar at Grill. She regularly draws enthusiastic audiences at Excellence in the Community and Backstage at the Grand Theater and other concert series. Darby-Duffin's first play, Dolls, will be audio streamed by Plan B Theater in June 2021. Next is LaToya Cameron. She was raised in Kaysville, graduated from Southern Utah University, and regularly performs at the Salt Lake Acting Company, Plan B Theater, and Pioneer, as well as the Denver Center for the Performing Arts and Utah Shakespeare Festival, and in 2012 debuted off-Broadway at the New York Musical Theater Festival. And Gabriella Huggins, a Salt Lake City native and multimedia producer, works as the community programs mentor at Spy Hop Productions. She teaches the innovative Sending Messages program, a podcasting program featuring stories produced by youth in custody. She has been recognized by Salt Lake County as an outstanding emerging arts professional. So I will now turn the time over to Paisley Rekdal. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm gonna hopefully get everybody up on video so I can see them, if that's okay. So the question, all our panelists, so Gabriella and Dee-Dee and Willie, and LaToya, great. Okay, so I have 4 kind of basic questions to ask, but from those questions, I want us to have a conversation. The biggest question to ask right now, I think, is what do you want the arts sector and arts audiences in particular to understand about barriers to participation for artists of color? How do you see those barriers? Have you encountered them maybe in your own activism and work? And don't all rush in, I swear, it's just, it's too much.
Well, I'll go since I'm already unmuted. I think the same barriers that were around in the before times, before COVID, are still some of the same barriers that we face as artists of color. Those being seen as not just artists of color, doing work that is all encompassing and doesn't just talk about our traumas. Writing some of our own stories, getting our own stories up and out there, so that those stories are more diverse than just the typical Utah fare that's usually played. Like, well, I won't name them. You don't need to, you know what I'm talking about. But I think those barriers haven't gone away. In fact, they've just been, heightened. I think we know about them more now that we aren't actually performing, or we're trying to figure out new ways to perform. And I think they're becoming they're glaring now, as opposed to just not being talked about. Now they're in your face and everybody knows about them, or everybody's going to know about them.
Yeah.
I'll say something too. I feel like in Utah in general, we kind of isolate or separate ourselves from what is happening across the country in regards how we handle racism. We're like, a lot of conversations that I've had in the theater, it's like, oh, we don't really participate in that. We're beyond that. You look at you're in the room with everybody else and all these things. When really that those microaggressions are definitely in the artistic world. there's many times that the dialogue that I have with people, it's like, you should be grateful that you're even being seen. You should be grateful that you're even here kind of attitude versus, no, I showed up and I did the work like everybody else in this room did. And so why is the conversation different with me versus different with everybody else? Just because I'm a part of the BIPOC community doesn't mean that my work is less than, or I haven't done the same kinds of work that my other artists in the room have done as well. So it's like, it's these microaggressions that people like are so trying to isolate themselves. Like the barriers, they probably don't even think that the barriers were here in Utah, because we're not in the South, but it definitely is in Utah, and we must talk about those kinds of barriers, because it is happening. It has been for a long time. And like Dee-Dee said, it's amplified, and it's going to continue to be even more amplified if we don't start really taking the work seriously, are my thoughts.
Oh, those are great.
I think to kind of speak to something Dee-Dee sort of mentioned and touched on as far as like what kind of stories are being told, and what Latoya is kind of talking about too, about like being in the room, but why is her work or our work as artists considered different? I think that part of the dynamic that's a barrier that I noticed in Salt Lake as well is that there's a really specific impulse that we have in the state because of how homogenous it is to continue recycling the same narratives. And then like as art becomes more and more visible, that art also becomes more and more sanitized to be palatable to a very specific population, which assumes a lot of things about like what it means to be white and like what kind of art white people like in this place. Like assumes a lot about like the kind of white people who have access to consuming art and what their politics might be and what they're interested in. So that's really interesting in and of itself. But I think something that's a really huge failure for our institutions is also only like tokenizing a handful of creators and artists, and also only featuring their stories if they fit into a very specific narrative of what it means to be a person of color. So I think, as Dee mentioned, like we have to sell our traumas in order for our work to be validated. Like everything, all of the work that exists by people of color that are present in this place is also like sort of celebrated and lauded because it's about like the struggle, and that we become essentialized to the oppressions that we face, when really we also have stories that are not just about our oppressions. We have things to share that are just about our oppressions. And I definitely recognize that, the way being a Black person and walking through the world does affect how I walk through the world every day, but I don't wake up in the morning and think I am a Black woman, like there are things about me that are rich and interesting. And when I create, I shouldn't have to sell my narrative in order for my creations to be seen as valid.
Right. Willie, what do you think?
Yeah, and to hone in on just what they've been mentioning, one thing I definitely wanted to point to was a lack of mentorship from people who share your background. Even those folks who do have access to like mentors and programs that are supporting the arts, if you're a young artist, it's transformative when you finally find somebody who actually is able to speak to the experience you're sharing. And that's something I've heard from all sorts of people, from like women who finally find women writers to be their mentors, and how that opens up their writing. And definitely was important for me when I finally had like my first Latino professor after like decades of education. So that's something I wanted to mention. And I also wanted to come at this question from the perspective of an attendee, where cost to attend things is always something that like should be mentioned, of like limiting our communities from having access to it. Representation being something that's really important, as both in content and in the performers. And then also just the atmosphere of a place. One memory I have of being in high school is I got a free ticket to go see The Color Purple over in Salt Lake City. So I was like, oh, cool. I went like on a date, took somebody there, and the minute I got there, I was like, oh, I'm not supposed to be here, just because of how like old and how like white the audience was. So it's crazy, as even with like the cost taken care of for me and like the representation, historically marginalized communities were being represented, even with those things being taken care of, I was still put in a situation as a youngster where I felt like deeply uncomfortable and like just not comfortable in the space.
I think those are such great comments. And I'm writing everything down because you guys were talking about it, because so much resonates with me as well. And some of the things that were coming up in your answers is this really fine line, it sounds like, that artists of color in particular are walking between wanting to be seen obviously as a whole person, not simply a bag of traumas that will be performed for somebody's interest and artistic edification, you know, a whole person that's not assumed to be unprepared or, you know, just a representative of a particular identity. And at the same time, recognizing that in fact, your identity as a representative is still there. That tension between wanting to be seen as more, and at the same time, because of the predominant narrative that the state offers, knowing that you can never entirely be that, or you can, it's just that it's going to be harder for people to recognize that as they're seeing this. And Willie's comment was so interesting to me about that idea of the representation works all the way down also in the audience itself, as well as the content and the bodies that are creating the content, which is that I think when it's true, you go to a space and everyone in the room is maybe an older white attendee feeling as if, wait, you know, do I belong here? I run a reading series I did run a reading series for the guest writer series at the University of Utah. And that issue comes up over and over again, which is, are we making our readings accessible on a lot of different levels to people? So I want to get back to something, I think it was Dee-Dee, you talked about this idea that some of these barriers have been heightened in some ways. Some of the things that we've been seeing before, worrying about before, thinking about before, have just in this moment become in some ways more fraught. So I'm wondering if you would talk a little bit about, I guess, how this moment might be influencing or not your own artistic work at this moment. And by this moment, I mean the racial equity protests and the conversation we're having around anti-racist practices. What is an anti-racist practice? What is an anti-racist art? I'm wondering how this is affecting your artistic work in any way. I'll throw that at you first, Dee-Dee, but obviously this is for everybody.
Well, actually, it's incredibly influential in that I perform jazz, which is a genre of music that was, you know, born and raised amongst people of color, specifically African Americans, and so some of the music and some of the lyrics are entertain ideas about being free and you know, things of that sort. So I will name a song specifically. So, and at every concert that I do, I always sing Strange Fruit. And at some concerts, depending on if they're family friendly, I sing the song by Nina Simone called Mississippi Goddamn. And those and it's been interesting, and when I say it's been heightened, what it's made me consider is my own personal safety, because before I could sing those songs and I could give you the history behind those songs and why I sang them and why I think they're important and why they're still relevant today. But you know, with the protest and my participation in Black Lives Matter, honestly, knowing that the songs that I sing or the words that I say out of my mouth, or even the phrase, the simple statement of Black Lives Matter, saying that in a public forum could upset someone so much that they will want to cause harm to my body. And so what it has caused me to do is add a security rider in my contracts that I've never had to think about before. And also thinking about where I live in terms of being in Salt Lake City. Salt Lake City is a concealed carry state. And so it's scary to think about someone being able to just do you harm because of the things that you say from your mouth that they don't agree with. And so that's the biggest thing that's occurred for me in terms of changing how I operate as an artist.
I think I don't personally consider myself an artist. Like I make some things, I think, but for me, most of my work is in educating and teaching and mentorship, and I find a lot of value and joy in that for sure. So I think about, when I think about creating art, I often think about it in the realm of like helping people produce or actualize their own visions, and like editing and like reworking with people, with my students that I work with. And I think something that has been really interesting about you know, this idea of like these heightened conversations or people's heightened awareness for me is that through my work with SpyHop specifically, I have always been in charge of these programs with people who exist on the margins. So rural youth who are incarcerated, youth who are in foster care, youth who have like a series of like, who are differently abled. And so, you know, some of like, in the question that when it was written, when I read it, there was like a section about it that was like class and educational barriers that have also been happening, coming up with these times. And I think for me, what's been really interesting and revealing is like, I've felt acutely aware of all of these different, I mean, obviously like I live these prejudices, these oppressions in my own body and in my own life, but also have been very aware of and have experienced professionally these barriers in working with the students that I'm charged with working with. And the way for me that I'm thinking about how it's changing my work is I don't think it's really changing my work necessarily. I think it's definitely changing the work that I'm watching other people who don't have to think about these things do their work. And it feels really, it's hard not to feel really pessimistic about it or really frustrated and really like personally offended by some of it, because it's like, oh, welcome to the club. Like you just never thought about this. You just never knew that this was real. And it's like, oh yeah, like my rural kids don't have computers. They can't do my programming because they don't have internet access. Like this has always been the thing, which is why I travel 5 hours and then don't use my phone for a week because there's no cell phone service down there. You know, like it's not new to me at all. You know, not being able to work with my students who are incarcerated because of like internet boundaries and confidentiality and their safety. All of these things are so inherent to the way that most people, I would argue, in this country, unfortunately, walk through the world, and they're just invisibilized. And I think that's across racial barriers, across class. And I think it's on one hand exciting, and there's possibility in these conversations being at the forefront. But again, these things aren't new. These conversations have been happening for literally hundreds of years in this country. And it feels really rushed and inauthentic in a lot of ways. It feels like people are trying to like cover their butts and like pivot so that they look like they're with it in institutions that are inherently complicit in and rely upon these larger institutions that are oppressive to these very same people. And so for me, when I think about my work then as a teacher, sorry, I'm rambling, I'm gonna finish it up. When I think about my work, like what I want to do always before these times is try to help my students locate themselves within larger systems so that they can be doing that critical thinking moving forward, as opposed to focusing on now, you know, how do we make ourselves look like we care about this work? Like that has been inherent to me for a really long time, so it's not really changing what I'm doing, but I do feel really critical of watching how people are failing to do it, which doesn't mean I shouldn't be trying, and not that it's like well-intentioned, but yeah, I'm just like, oh, you're just coming to this. It's really frustrating.
Oh, I wish I could say something, but Latoya, please.
I'm like, no, please do.
No.
No, it's interesting because during this time, you know, when basically the world stopped, I remember thinking to myself, I'm like, oh, this is like an opportunity for me to create. I write as well, and like I sing and like to kind of sit down and start to create. Then the world started to really reveal itself of like what's happening, what should be happening, and like I feel like it's like the destruction of the society that we thought that we were in, and those who wanted to keep those like images and mirages up that ain't happening anymore, like we're ripping them down. And so when I started kind of reassessing, trying to create in that kind of energy, in that kind of space, I was just like, I couldn't. It lasted for maybe like 2 days. if I was lucky. And then I was just like, I just felt so not motivated. I felt defeated. I felt like that kind of not maybe a hint of hopelessness until it became like a very intense rage with the murder of George Floyd. And that anger and that frustration and that just like, this isn't like, I can't believe this is like, we're still in this repetition, this repeating of history, like, you know, feeling unsafe, but like wanting to essentially burn things down. And realizing, you know, as much as I believe that what I do as an actor can cause change, and it has and it will, but not necessarily the change that incorporates everybody, that involves everybody, like the theater has made itself to seem like for a very long time. And so it kind of made me stop and kind of go, well, if I'm not going to be doing that on stage, which I don't feel so drawn to right now, how can I assist in uplifting the voices of my people and my BIPOC community, and holding those theaters that I have worked with before accountable, who have come out and said, we stand with you, when everything prior to those moments have showed us that they haven't. And we are not a trend. We are not just this, you know, popular moment where people are going to jump on board and be a part of something and then it completely be erased by the time that, you know, people get bored with what's going on. Like, that can't happen anymore. I personally refuse to have that happen anymore. So I've gone back with a group of people and started to send letters and started to become more of an activist, speaking up more, which most people know me. I'm very kind of just like, you know, show up, do my work, now, you know, be creative and playful as much as I can, and then, you know, go home and continue that work and to come back refreshed, ready to go. But that is not the world that I'm in. That's not the world that we all are in. Especially in theater cannot be what it used to be. It needs to evolve with what is happening. It just needs to change. It's over time. So I've been kind of more so going behind the scenes with administration kind of work in regards to having those really difficult conversations with local theater companies to see how we can continue the conversation, to hold them accountable, to actually do better, to put in policies and procedures, to do better, to have inclusivity and diversity for the moving on forward with theater in general. Because I don't want to be in the world. I don't want to pretend that this isn't happening. It has been happening. It always has been happening, and the theater just has to change. So I suppose my creativity isn't really that kind of creativity. It's just more so taking a pause on that and moving behind the scenes to actually see the change that needs to happen. So.
Thank you. Willie, what are you thinking? How's it been affecting your work?
I would echo a lot of what has already been said. There's always that tension between like, should I be writing right now or should I be activist organizing and doing stuff like that? I echo a lot of the stuff I've experienced as an educator, where I've been able to create spaces where students can process and like have these conversations where they haven't had them in the artistic spaces yet. So I was able to do that. And for me, it's just a matter that like all this social turmoil is combined with personal turmoil for a lot of people. So what it comes down to for a lot of the folks and a lot of the artists I know is, yes, keeping your head above water and floating and surviving and and art becomes a space where we go to heal and try to create a sense of okayness. So that's all I really have to say. It's been definitely a challenge for all the artists I've known, kind of trying to keep up with the momentum. Yes, because we know that this is the opportunity for change, the window to get social change is gonna close up again. So a lot of us are just trying our best to keep up.
I'm just, as I was listening to all of you speak, and I was moved by all of the things that you were saying, and I saw bits of myself in almost everything that you were saying. I mean, I come from this from an educator. I think all of us wear multiple identities. We're not just artists in our own fields. I mean, you know, or we do different types of work. We educate as well as we are students. We're in the community in different ways. And those of us, friends of mine I know who are mothers, there's a lot of gender problems right now too, also trying to educate a child at the same time, you know, keep a job. Almost everyone is just flailing. But one thing I want to return to is something I think both Gabriella and LaToya really articulated so powerfully, which is the fragile trust going forward, or the fragile hope based on working with institutions that have in the past not necessarily had our best interests at heart, or the best interests of other writers and artists of color at heart, or at least not explicitly, not in ways that we would recognize. And the sort of tightrope walking that goes along, I think, with trying to continue to push something forward. You know, I feel that same personally. I'm at the university. I've been put on, I imagine like all of us have been put on many committees, right? We're probably attending many of these talks, right? And it's both a joyful thing. I'm grateful to be asked to do this sort of talk. And to be frank with you, I'm exhausted. This is not, I'm sure for all of you too, this is not the first time we've been asked to have this conversation. And the concern for me always is, does it become performative? When does it become instrumental? And for us, and for you all, it's very clearly instrumental. It's something you're doing every day. And so there is this, personally, I feel a little anxious about the cynicism and the anger sometimes I feel, the hope I also feel about having a conversation that it feels like a lot of people have been having for a really long time. I think, as Gabriella and LaToya both saying, and now other people want to join in on that conversation, and you want to welcome that at the same time. I get worried that the university, for example, will not do what it keeps saying it wants to do. But I find that fascinating as you guys were talking about this, this tension also between what kind of work we want to pour ourselves into, as Willie was talking about. Do we want to, you know, is this the time to produce our own stuff, or is this a time to become a better administrator or something like that, as some of us are doing, right? And that pull is yet another potential barrier, I think, for you know, artists of color right now, which is the multiple hats that now we're all being asked to wear. I want to go back to something that was also brought up earlier by a number of you about Utah's specific culture, its specific reputation, the culture in the audience, and its own history maybe. So I'd like you to talk a little bit about how you think that context of being in Utah, Utah's history, Utah's predominant culture, however you want to define it, how that influences your work or the reception of your work. You guys have talked about that a little bit, but I'd like if you could speak some more about that. And actually, I'll start, if you don't mind, Gabriella, I mean, because you think you were talking about that quite a bit before.
Yeah, okay. Way to put me on the spot, Paisley. No, just kidding. Oh, Utah and this place in reception and perception. I think, again, okay, so for me personally, I think the history of this place and being from here and being a minority in this place, the way that it influences the way that I think about stuff that gets put out, or the way that I observe like art that is created by my students, the art that I have access to as a consumer, and also like arts organizations, and I think just nonprofits that I've been involved with historically. I feel like there's, okay, this is like big. So I think that Salt Lake specifically has, you know, we're this reputation of like blue and a sea of red. And I think that our arts community has an idea of itself as like Latoya is talking about, like Dee-Dee's saying, like Willie's saying, like we are trying to be diverse. We are hoping, like University of Utah is hoping to do these things, and they're all like these like sort of kick the can down the road aspirations. And then the way that they back that up is by forward facing, putting up students or staff members who are the tokens in this diverse situation at the forefront of, you know, speaking events. And, you know, I feel like a lot of times my work with SpyHop, which I think is really important and beautiful and valuable, is has a light shown on it only when it's meant to pull certain heartstrings. So again, it's this reproducing of trauma narratives for specific groups of people, but that work is also the work that gets, like, it's really hard to fund. It's really hard for governmental institutions to fund it. Like SpyHop works on grants mostly, and like, you know, we get to do a lot of great programming, but we have struggled historically with some of these programs to get the correct funding for it, because also based on the demographics, the work that is created is not also feeding into that like narrative of what people want to see, what makes them feel good, what stories make them feel good from these people, and the production quality is a whole other thing. But I think it's really interesting how people of color, and maybe like 2 or 3 people of color, are used over and over again in this community for institutions to pat themselves on the back, like that they're doing something good by having this one Black person or this one queer person, or telling this homeless story in a museum that people can't afford to go to anyway. Like, I think that Salt Lake has a big problem with trying to distance itself from like the rest of the state, but over and over again being like showing that they are complicit in some of the racism they're assuming is happening in other places in rural Utah or whatever that isn't happening in this city. That is like, you know, those murals down by Fisher painted by a white man using like street art style, but like, you know, we're patting ourselves on the back for doing that work, but we're like stealing POC art styles. We're like, you know, giving recognition to this white artist. Can't remember his name, but I'll figure it out and put it in the chat. I think there's just like a lot of performance and I think the performance is like this really specific countercultural backlash to like the LDS church in the state. It's like white people here, I think white institutions here and people with institutional power here who want to think of themselves as progressive and open-minded do a lot of really racist things in trying to like distance themselves from that, because they don't want to actually do any of that deep hard work of creating like inclusive spaces, diversifying their workforces or their way of thinking. I mean, even assuming that, again, like the artists of color even want to be included in these institutions. Like, I think that inclusion is a really tricky word as well. So yeah, I think just there's a plausible deniability that exists in Salt Lake because we are liberal, but we're also so white. And so there's not even a lot of interaction between these institutions and people of color, the people they purport to care about. And so it's really easy for people of color to be touted. And maybe it's just a handful of us, and that is a barrier for creators who don't get recognition from the state or from the city or from whatever, to feeling like they can be included, even if they want to be included, because it's very clear that the city is not for our art and for our stories.
Yeah.
One of the big things that I want to mention is, yes, as an artist, like one of the things you wrestle with is, yes, who is your audience? And that's like a really important question as you're like going through your work, who you're trying to communicate with. And I feel like one of the biggest limitations with Utah is that for a lot of artists of color, the audience that is in Salt Lake City might not be their audience at all. And for me personally, leaving Salt Lake City was what allowed my work to be able to finally blossom. Yes, because I didn't have to worry about like what this audience would understand and have them in mind when I was creating. And that's just something I wanted to mention, just because that it's tough to know. For me, it's always been about trying to create these spaces where we can exist as our full selves. And sometimes that means choosing our audience rather than just letting everybody in. And that's something that's always been a wrestle in a lot of the work we do in diversity and inclusion. Like, how do you create, like, quote unquote safe spaces for folks to be able to share their work and be completely whole in it, while allowing as diverse of a group as possible to get in. And I just wanted to mention that about audiences.
I want to take a moment before I speak to Dee-Dee and Latoya and have them answer as well to kind of press down on what you just said, Willie, and think about what Gabriella was also saying, because what's fascinating is that there is, I think all of us are probably creating work that is absolutely for as many people as possible. In that sense, we're not thinking, as Willie is saying, about the state, and yet the finances, the audience, that the resources, for better or for worse, we might come to rely on are very local. And so that tension between local support, local grooming, local perceptions, stands in some sort of relief, or at least in some conversation with where we are nationally as artists, what we are producing for people outside of the immediate realm. And that some of that tension is just sort of something I want to return to at some point. But I'm curious about Latoya, Dee-Dee, what you're thinking about in terms of what we're talking about with the conversation around Salt Lake City, Utah, and that influence on your work, if there is one.
Well, for me, I think the state itself was formed so that people could stop being persecuted and do their own thing. And I think it's really an interesting kind of dichotomy that when other groups are like, hey, we'd like to do our own thing too, or we'd like to be included, that everybody all of a sudden has amnesia and they don't remember what any of that felt like. And so they operate in this, I can give you one thing to do, and then it goes back to being it goes back to, I call it the Technicolor Dreamcoat version of Utah. And it's like when you talk about it in terms of numbers, like when you say, if you do if you do 5 shows a year over the course of 10 years, and so that's 50 shows, and only 2 of those shows have included people of color, then the numbers don't match your rhetoric. The numbers don't match what you say when you say, I'm inclusive, I do these things, I put on a show, we do this, we do that. And when you can have a conversation with people that says, yes, that was great, that was the one thing that was awesome, but do more, I think is where it kind of stops, and people go, wait, but I did something. I did this. Isn't that enough? And my response now, has been absolutely not. Absolutely not. It's not, like, when you can't just say, oh, that was enough, right? You just have to stop saying that because I did this one thing, because I performed this one thing, because I was an ally that one time, that was enough. Because that's like putting a Band-Aid over the Hoover Dam and saying we're plugging up holes. And I think that in Utah especially, we just want to kind of forget all of the bad history so that we can maintain this positive front, and so everybody thinks we're like squeaky clean and nothing's wrong over here, but that's not the way the world is working right now. And I think we have to get honest with ourselves. I think we're getting honest with ourselves, and that's why it's feeling a little icky sometimes, because like you said, Paisley, I mean, I thought it was interesting that that you mentioned being exhausted. I mean, we definitely exhausted. Having these conversations, continuing to have these conversations, like now, I know because I've spoken with her, me and Latoya are like, oh my gosh, wow, another conversation. Okay. you know, and we gird up our loins so that we can participate in these, because we think it's important, where anybody's going to gather and listen to our thoughts about race and systemic racism and the power structure in America. We want to be heard. We think that's great. But yes, it is also exhausting to continue to have these conversations. And right now, I'm saying to other people, you have work to do also. And I used to say it about being an audience member coming to the theater. Like, there's work for you to do as an observer, as a listener, as much as there is for us as actors and performers to like get ready to interpret this work. And that's also true for this very important dynamic thing that's happening, you know, this, to keep our fingers on the pulse of what's happening with, you know, how we want to address systemic racism. Like, you have to do some of your own work, and you can't just continue to utilize the resources of your BIPOC friends and, you know, continue asking them, because it is exhausting.
Amen. LaToya.
Yeah, I'm like, yes, and that's it. Just kidding. Yeah, well, and that's the thing. I think that people, especially here with performative activism, it's interesting to me when people want to be a part of something and they do one thing and they do pat themselves on the back, and then you're like, all right, cool. Well, we're gonna be meeting again this date, and they're like, you're doing more? I thought that was it. And it's like, oh no, that was not even, like, we're not even in the door yet. Like, we're trying to get to the door to even knock. Like, the work is not, we're not even close. And how quickly they also are not there anymore, you know, because they can't, a lot of people don't understand what the actual true work is going to entail. Even I don't even know, you know, what that's going to look like, but I'm willing to do it, and I'm willing to go there, and I'm willing to keep pushing to see what I can do in my lifetime to see the kind of change I want to see. So it's always interesting when people are just like, I did that, and it's like, oh, what'd you do? you still got, we're not even halfway there. We're not even there. But I guess in regards to the Utah, not only the audience, I guess, you know, growing up in Utah, especially in Kaysville, which used to be a very small farm town. And now it's become like a huge suburban kind of, like, you know, development. That's Davis County. Like, it's just getting bigger every single year. The identity comes up for me right now, listening to everybody and just kind of self-reflecting on that question, trying to find your identity, not only in the art, but just your identity here in Utah in itself, you know. It's something I often actually write about. I feel often like betwixt two worlds often, where I'm trying to just be myself, and being myself is always questioned. Is that really authentic? Or is that really you? Oh, you're not this enough and you're not that enough, so therefore that's not true. I remember having conversations with actually fellow artists where he came up to me and he was like, you're not really Black. And I looked at him and I was like, and he was white. And I said, okay, well then you tell me. You go ahead and tell me what it is to be Black, because you obviously know something I must be missing. And he was like, well, I was like, well, I'm not what the stereotypes you see on television. I don't talk a certain way that you deem as Black. What is it? And he couldn't answer the question. It's like, especially just in Utah, they want to like pick you down about, like, you're not this or not, you're not that. And it really becomes confusing when you go into a space of creativity. I mean, I can create in that space for myself to talk about identity. But then when I go into a space where it becomes like a show that traditionally wasn't a person of color playing this role, and instead of just me bringing myself and my identity to the table, it becomes, no, it's not that. You need to be more like this. you need to be more like that. You need to do this. No, that sounds a little too much, like, you know, too urban. You need to bring that back. And I'm like, what does that even mean? I'm just talking, and this is my interpretation of the piece. So I have to even like code switch in my own, in Utah, not just only outside and just to survive in the Utah culture, in the Salt Lake culture, because I feel like Utah in itself has so many different cultures within itself, because it's trying to figure out what its own identity is on like an everyday basis. So it's like, how are you going to come at me trying to tell me how to define myself when you can't even define yourself, you know? So, and then when I go into like an all like Black cast, it's not questioned. I feel like I have to like catch up because I haven't had the mentors that I wish that I could have had in my education to know how to interpret certain texts and stuff without having the influences of what happened when I'm doing Shakespeare or an Ibsen piece, you know, stuff like that, where it's this culture doesn't allow you to just be, because it's always trying to judge you and depict you instead of just letting people be who they are innately and to continue on their own path and journey to figure out what that looks like in the end for themselves. And that does a huge disservice, I think, for everybody, especially if you are a part of a marginalized culture that is always being put under a microscope.
As I'm
I have a
listening,
quote. Sorry, can I share something real quick? Paisley? I have a quote on that note, Latoya. It's from a professor of African American Studies, I believe at Northwestern University. His name is Cecilio M. Cooper. And he has this quote that I think encapsulates this idea really well. And it's, "I am prized most as a vector through which others can accomplish themselves." And I think it's really interesting just how, you know, like listening to especially other Black people in this place talk about how like that search for identity is really difficult and precarious here, is because again, like it just is us trying to navigate ourselves in a place where we're not represented through a lens that like also, and it's also this weird thing too, because again, like, okay, Latoya's not Black enough, but she's also Black in a way that white establishment values and like wants her to be Black. The way that we can speak, the way that I speak, like my educational background, the professionalization of whatever, right? I'm not that kind of Black. And so that kind of Black is not the Black that makes people feel good either. But I'm Black that makes people feel good here. And so it's really interesting, just like, I don't know, that's just something I've been thinking about lately.
you know, what we're all sort of talking about, or what I hear all of you sort of talking about, goes back to that what is it when we're talking about systemic racism? What is the system of racism that's really at work here? And one of the things that keeps coming up, I think, in this conversation is the idea that there can only be one representation of this authentic identity. And one of the reasons that exists is because the aesthetic standards and values are so white that it can only recognize, or it has created the space for only one or two representations to get through. And if those one or two representations have been, as Dee-Dee points out, presented on stage or presented in, you know, the theater is, you know, presented on the page, we don't need any more, says, you know, the white system. It's like, we've got that covered. And then anything else is deemed inauthentic, right? Because we know what authentic looks like. And I think one of the things I hear some of you saying is the frustration of running up against that, because not only does it hurt you individually as an artist and as a person, saying like, who do I have to fight against, I have to actually struggle on every level to be seen, but it also suggests that the entire responsibility of a non-white aesthetic is completely on the artist of color's shoulders. There's no expectation that white people getting educated are going to be educated in a way that they can read a diverse group of writers, see a diverse group of artists, you know, watch diverse movies and have a fluency in those aesthetics so that they can say there can absolutely be more than one representation, because they'll recognize there is more than one way to be Asian American or African American or Latinx or any of these things, right? It would be, these kinds of identities would be granted the same expansiveness and individuation that white identity is granted. And we get that actually through art, because we say, look, we can have all these different types of white narratives, but we still are not in a place, it sounds like from what I'm listening to you say, where we are allowing that to be the case for BIPOC artists. And that has even more, powerful effects in a place like Utah, where I think, and I heard a couple of people saying very powerfully, everything's got to look good. We got to make this sound nice, right? We got to look for the good in, like the cathartic, happy ending, or there's no money, or there's no audience, or there's no deeming of authenticity there, which is really, kind of scary and dangerous. Okay, so we have 6 minutes. So here's another like enormous bomb of a question. Oh my God. Okay, so what does progress look like? And then this is the question I think, and on everyone's lips, and feel free to sort of say, I don't want to answer this question, but what are some anti-racist steps that can be taken? Have a time.
Okay, I'm gonna just say it. I honestly, I think it's really interesting that that the question is posed to artists of color mostly. I think you need to ask I think you need to ask white people, what are you going to do to be anti-racist? That's not to say that, people of color can't have prejudices, but the system that's been set up, the institutionalization of racism, we can't fix. And don't you think it's really, this is what I think is really interesting, is because LaToya mentioned code switching. Like, I can operate I can parlay with the president, and I can also, go back home and, get down with the get down. Like, I can be in all of these spaces and make myself large or small, or, I can do that. But when we ask white people to get some knowledge about, what is happening with us, or, to learn some stuff, it's like we're asking for the world. And I don't think that that's a lot to ask. And so for me, it's, stop asking me what you can do to be an anti-racist. Like, go do the work, the same work that I had to do to learn about myself and my history. I did that. I put that work in so that I could speak eloquently about, the things that are affecting me. And I think it's disingenuous at the very least, but I think it's also dangerous at the to continue to think that the fix and to continue to use people of color to ask them, what can we do to fix it? I just think I just think that puts a lot on that. You're not doing any of the work. What do you get to do? That's what I'm going to say. So stop asking me, ask yourself, what can I do specifically to combat this systemic racism? Not anyway.
Can I add? Yeah, I'm just going to jump right off of that, Dee-Dee, because I think that's spot on. I'm married to a white man, and we have this conversation a lot about this kind of what can I do? What am I supposed to do? And I've been with this person for a very, very long time, since I was 18. So it's almost 10 years in this relationship, growing up as people who have very different backgrounds. And I think that's something that we have, a thought that we've been tossing around and throwing around is this idea of what my friend Abdullah calls white caution, which is this idea that there's a lot of when white people are posed with a what do I do sort of question, they fail to, it's almost like white people have a hard time trying to create independent, authentic, critical thought around issues of race, because it makes them so uncomfortable to be wrong about race, right? It's this classic thing of it's worse to be called a racist than to be doing racist things. And I think what's a dynamic at play in arts communities, I see it in organizations that I've been part of. I see it especially within liberal-minded nonprofit sector communities, this seeking a validation from an individual brown person or Black person to like, to come to a conclusion about something that you can do. So it's like, oh, like, well, what would a Black audience think of this? And I was like, well, what do you think of this? How about you form an opinion? How about you do some thinking about it? Instead of coming to Black people to ask this one Black person what they think, so that you can form your opinion based on what they think. And it's racist because it also offloads, again, this work onto this brown person to help you form an opinion. When, like, yes, you might form an opinion that could be racist, and you throw that at a wall and you do some reading and you do some research and you talk to more than just the one Black person that you happen to be able to text that you never talk to about anything else ever. Like, you can have an opinion about something as a white person, as a straight person. It's like, you are allowed to have opinions that you should be testing. You shouldn't be forming opinions exclusively based off of like what you think the monolithic Black, because it creates a monolith of this person that's part of this community. It offloads that work onto them. It means that you don't have to engage, which is then a failure. It's either that, or then just like people just don't engage at all, you know, silencing content, not being able to have certain conversations, because again, it goes back to this idea of covering your butt and being unwilling to be called out or to be told that you're wrong. And obviously, like, you know, I think people have a lot of anxiety around like, you know, cancellation culture and call out culture or whatever. Like this, again, this idea of being wrong, being like this space that you can't come back from. But I think, as Paisley, you were saying, like having, you know, a foundation of education. Oh wait, did you say it, Latoya, maybe? Having a foundation of education that like allows you to, I think you would be Paisley, having a foundation of education with like literature and arts that isn't just centered around identity that you specifically identify with would help you probably be better equipped to answer some of these questions or to form some thoughts. And I think that white people seem right in this moment to be grappling with feeling they have to face some racism and not knowing where to go, and then feeling really like, just like unwilling to explore before you come to opinion, maybe like testing those conversations out with people around you, but instead we just don't even have these conversations and we avoid them like the plague. And that makes all of our work as POC harder. That makes, it just reinforces all of these really problematic dynamics. And so I think what Dee-Dee's saying absolutely is like, don't keep asking POC. Like, it's cool that we're talking right now, we're having conversations, and I'm glad to be like seeing other people of color in my community who are creators and hearing what their thoughts are. But I feel like, again, like these conversations, it's just like rehashing and rehashing and rehashing. It's like, how about y'all talk to each other? Like, do you guys have ideas? Do you have thoughts? Because we've been saying it too. So like, I don't know, like, are you not listening? Are you not reading? Like, this is not new.
Yeah, and one thing I want to add to that, one tension that I always had to wrestle with when I was coordinating down at Southern Utah University is this idea that we've been talking about, like not expecting POC people to educate or to take the burden of that, along with this other idea, which the catchphrase for it is nothing about us without us. So the idea behind this is that there was a lot of organizations that would try to hold like a, you know, Mexican themed event or something like that, and like not be in consultation or in conversation with any Latino people like during that. And so it's this tension where it's like, ideally we'd be working alongside each other, but until the cultural competency and fluency is gained, doing that work becomes a burden on the POC organizers who are putting it together. Yeah, what it's come down to as far as like thinking of anti-racist steps, for me, it'd be like finding POC organizations that you can partner with and that you can actually bring something to the table and support them with, while like following their lead in the work that's going on. And also supporting the creation of spaces that are POC centered. There's a few places like the Theater Artists of Color that Plan B has that I think is a really good project and idea that's been really supporting POC community there. There's a women of color writers collective called Workwords that has been doing a lot of good work supporting young women of color writers emerging. So I believe that these spaces, supporting these spaces and the creation of spaces like this, I think should be a part of this conversation of how do we move forward, along with partnering with organizations that are already doing this work.
Yeah, and sorry, one more thing to jump off what Willie was just saying too, like these places do exist, and I think part of this dynamic too is when, as organizations and arts collectives and institutions who have power move forward in doing this anti-racist work, I think part of doing the anti-racist work is understanding that the question is not how do I include you in my vision for you, but how do you as an organization, as a group of people that I like want for diversity or whatever, how am I a tool for you, a resource for you to get to your own ends and aims? And I think there's so much work to be done into shifting that narrative. I think, like, you know, when we're talking about money and power and funders, right? Funders become, I think, at least from the nonprofit perspective for me, funders become like their vision becomes the driving force for all of the work. And so it's completely secondary what the students that we're working with need, what the communities that we're working with need. We go to them so we can pad our numbers for diversity's sake, and then organizationally, we have no respect for these communities at all, for their stories. We want to critique how they tell stories. We want to, you know, try to like amplify their stories in a specific way or get them to make specific types of work so that our funders are happy, so that the community can be happy. It's so paternalistic, and it's white supremacistly paternalistic. So yeah, just shifting the way in which we approach doing anti-racist work as not being centered on our intentions, but really caring about what moving forward, like how we can be a resource to the community we want to help or whatever.
Latoya.
And I would just say what everyone just said. I would also say, take the time. It's not a rushed process. Really, truly take the time to do it. Because, and it's already been mentioned in this talk before, everyone's like at a rush pace of wanting to like fix the problem now. And that's not what is being asked of people to do. It's really, really actually take the time to really do the work and slow down and reassess and really digest the information. That's what I would say.
One thing I would add, and I think it probably just echoes what most of you have been saying, is I think we have an idea of anti-racist work, especially in institutions, is always outward facing. Like, who do we put out in front of cameras? Who do we put out on a stage? Who do we put out in conversation? But as we've all noted, a lot of the real decisions and power are not out, they're in, they're deeply in, right? And that's one of the things that is so personally uncomfortable for me. Like, oftentimes when I'm thinking about the work that I do in the university and the way I benefit outwardly, but the way in which maybe that outward benefit comes because I'm not changing a lot of stuff inwardly in the university. And there's a lot of stuff that I'm actually benefiting from that is hurting other people, and is really hurting other people of color and other women. And, you know, and it's a really tough thing to sit down, and I'm doing that work at the university, and there are thousands of anti-racism and diversity committees in which I will be born and die. But as I'm on these committees, we're having this conversation about like, what are the institutional values we believe in? And why do we believe in those things? How did we get to the place where we have this idea of what meritocracy looks like, and we have this idea about what excellence looks like, and we have this idea about what a promotion, you know, requires and deserves, and what gets that? And do we still believe in that? And in what ways does that belief system reflect something that maybe we shouldn't anymore? We should change that. And so, like, I guess the only thing I would say about this is, for anti-racist work, I mean, the question is not just who are you putting forward to make yourself maybe look good or make yourself feel more comfortable, but what is the stuff that is actually making your life comfortable, that is maybe invisible to other people, including yourself. And I mean this seriously. Like, I'm doing this with the university, and these are some painful and embarrassing conversations we're all having, and I'm messing up all the time. So we don't have a lot of time left, and I want to get to questions that the audience out there have. And here's one that's quite interesting. A question I would love to ask are your thoughts, panelists, about COVID-19 and how justice, equity, and anti-racism work in the cultural sector connects to COVID, especially in how we need to adapt as a sector under COVID-19. So, put that
well, I have a thought.
All right.
I think what's so interesting about even these times is, like, again, this entire conversation, like the reason this panel exists is a direct response to COVID-19 shutdowns and the fact that there was a George Floyd's death, from my opinion, became a jumping off point for people who were stuck at home and scared and bored to get into the streets and do something. And it gave them an excuse to feel like, oh, I can be out here without masks. Like, you know, I was watching the protests out here when like they went off several weeks ago, and there was like, which, you know, like I have very particular opinions about hair. I have locks. There's like a white man with locks without a mask on yelling at cops. And I'm like, this is really ironic. I think there's some like interesting, deeper work to do here about like, let's talk about hair. Let's talk about why you're not wearing a mask, protesting a Black person's death in a pandemic that's disproportionately killing Black people. Like, the cognitive dissonance here is insane to me. And I think that, you know, I mean, even with the conversation around racism, like I feel like a much more pessimistic, I'm a hopeful person, but I carry a lot of pessimism. Like I think that work is important. I will never stop doing work, but I have low expectations so that I can only be pleasantly surprised, I guess. And I think that like there's the connection between race, the connection between class, the connection between COVID-19, like all of these things are intersectional. Like none of these things stands alone. None of these issues is singular. And so, sorry, just to read the question one more time, just to make sure I get every point. Cultural sector connected to COVID, especially how we need to adapt as a sector under COVID-19. I think talking about adapting in this context is back to this idea of these things being connected. Like there's so much more work to do than just talking about racism, to talk about how COVID-19 is exacerbating problems in our communities. That looks like how we're voting, that looks like how we are protesting, that looks like how we're practicing mutual aid within our communities, how we're providing resources to like, you know, our Indigenous family members down on the Navajo reservation that are being insanely disproportionately affected by this crisis. And like what it looks like to be accountable, not just to like racism work and not just to that work in like an intellectualized or professionalized manner by like going to diversity training, but like on the ground, what can you do as an individual in your community with the people that you live with the people that you work with, the people that you see, to not be having just conversations, and maybe you don't know all the answers, or you don't, like we don't have time for this to be esoteric and like, how do I get my race stuff right? It's like, how do I provide tangible things to people? Like, how do I ask people what they need and show up and do that for them? Like that kind of community level building is so important, I think, to challenging the institutions and systems that have put these structures in place in the first place. Because I think a lot of the time we spend a lot of the time up here having these conversations about like, who am I gonna vote for? How is it intellectualized? When really like the barriers to access to entry to power, as we're talking about, are so many that how do we actually invest in each other as communities and build that power and work from the ground up? Like I think that's the kind of work like Latoya's talking about and Dee's talking about, Willie's talking about, like making your art and escaping into that, but also having conversations with your family and your friends and organizing. Like that basis is the only way that I think we meaningfully challenge these systems. And that is long time work. I don't expect to see that work in my lifetime even. But I think that, you know, not seeing those fruits doesn't mean that labor isn't completely worth it.
Anyone else have thoughts? I can, everyone's like, no. I have.
Just ditto everything Gabby just said, just ditto to everything she just said.
Yeah, I would say one other small thing, because I thought Gabby just hit it on the head there. Because what we are talking, I mean, we're back to something that has sort of floated through our conversation over and over. This is my dog who's going to show up here. Apologies. The question about money and capitalism and the very deep ways that COVID has revealed something that I think a lot of people have known for a very long time, which is the very radical inequities and access that people have had. And so, you know, it is interesting, it's framed in this question about the art world, but in general, and artists are, you know, in some ways, I've got lots and lots and lots of friends, I'm sure all of us have, who are really terrified right now. Lots of things have been taken away, income, all sorts of stuff. But they're not just terrified as artists. I mean, they're terrified as mothers, as fathers, parents, right? They're terrified as people with parents and children who are fragile in this environment as well. But yeah, I mean, one of the questions that we always have to keep coming back to is this intersectional, as Gabby was saying before, this intersectional way in which it's not just COVID, it's not just race, it's not just one of these things. It's the way all of these things intersect together, and that's what makes it lifetime work. Yeah. It looks like there are no questions. I think we've killed. Oh wait, okay. This is a question. How do you all navigate when others tone police you? The expectation that you have to educate and advocate for yourself with a smile on your face. All right, I will throw that out to the group.
I'm going to share a resource that my dear friend shared with me, and it's about white supremacy institutions, and it's like a checklist of white supremacy institutions. It's from I'll send the link, I'll figure it out. But it's from a website called showingupforracialjustice.org. And it's just this list that I think is really interesting. And one of the things that it talks about is like these different ways in which white supremacy shows up in institutions, and how I think tone policing is addressed in this really nicely. Let me see if I can find it. Also, anyone can go while I figure this out. Okay. Fear of open conflict is a listed agenda, is a listed feature of organizations that function under white supremacy. And so it's fear of open conflict. 1, people of power are scared of conflict and try to ignore it or run from it. 2, when someone raises an issue that causes discomfort, their response is to blame the person for raising the issue rather than look at the issue which is actually causing the problem. 3, emphasis on being polite. And 4, equating the raising of difficult issues with being impolite, rude, or out of line. And so the anecdotes, this cool thing about this checklist is it also has like some suggested anecdotes. The anecdotes are role-play ways to handle conflict before conflict happens. Distinguish between being polite and raising hard issues. Don't require those who raise hard issues to raise them in acceptable ways, especially if you are using the ways in which issues are raised as an excuse to not address the issues being raised. And once conflict is resolved, take the opportunity to revisit it and see how it might have been handled differently.
Nice. Anyone else have any suggestions?
I think the only thing I'd add is that for me, that question kind of points to the need to build a strong community around yourself, because there should be people who you are able to be that complete self where you don't need to worry about policing your tone around. And a lot of the situations I end up professionally and artistically where I end up needing to like put on that polite face while I make these criticisms just so that they're well received. A lot of what gets me through that and having the energy to do that is the fact that I have community I can go to and process with. It's not something that we like when we're being strategic. It's something that sometimes we have to do or feel like we ought to do. So I guess that's what I want to kind of emphasize and push towards there, is making sure that we're building strong communities around ourselves that can support you through this work.
Excellent. Anyone else?
I'm still pondering the question because I'm like, I probably right now have been just being like shutting it down. So I don't know if I'm really helpful in this moment. I'm just like, no, we're not doing that. I'm not going to participate in that behavior anymore. And so I just let it be known. I don't put on that smile face anymore. I let it become a self-reflective moment for the person that I'm having the discussion with, who are trying to tone police me when I'm just honestly talking how I am with you all right now. And I refocus the information back to the person I'm discussing it with and asking them, why are they trying to skew this conversation to be what they want it to be, or why are they doing what they're doing? What is coming up for them in that moment of when we're having this kind of discussion? And I listen to the verbiage of what they're saying to me in response of what that is. And I bring it back to them, because really, honestly, it has nothing to do with me. It has everything to do with the person that I'm having the discussion with, and the stuff that's coming up for them. They need to self-reflect on that, not me. So
should have t-shirts made saying it's not you, it's not me, it's you. Dee-Dee.
Say that recently I've allowed myself to showcase some of the frustration and anger that's come up a little bit more. But I think one of my strategies for that whole tone policing is to use my proximity to my allies, and I put it on them. So like, I remember being at a dinner party, and there was an older white gentleman that wanted to have a conversation with me about. We were not on the same page at all. And my husband is also white, and I was like, oh, this is you. This is your conversation. This is not me. He's not ready for me yet. You need to work on him a little bit first, and then we can have like, he needs some, like a course first from you, so that he can have a conversation with me, because he's not ready yet. He's not ready. And I get it. I have to meet him where he is. And so for me, it's about asking those people who have the most in common with the people that want to have a conversation with you, or that want to kind of police your thoughts. And it's saying, all right, here's what you can do. You can go have a conversation with the people who are like-minded like you, because they're going to listen to you. You have the persuasion and the background and the culture and the experience to have a conversation with them first, and get them up to speed. And then that shows that they've been doing some work, and then we can have a conversation, because I'm still doing work over here. And so I think that that's what some of our allies and the people who love us and are asking, what can I do? What can I do? It's talk to the people who are closest to you, because it's your job to convince them, right? It's not ours. It's your job to convince them, help them, show them, what the work that you've been doing, get them up to speed, so that they can continue to have these conversations and be open to being uncomfortable having those conversations. Because I remember also at that dinner party, my friend who was there wanted to shut it down, because she thought that it was, she thought it was tense, and it was. Conversations about race are just going to be tense and uncomfortable. But I thought it was interesting that what she kept saying to me was, I know this guy, we're all on the same page. And I said, actually, we're not. And I think you have to be okay with the fact that even though you know him, you don't know him with me. You've never seen him try to have a conversation about race with a Black person. And so the things that are coming out of his mouth are surprising to you. And I think you need to let that happen, so that you can know all of the things about him, and then take him to lunch without me and have conversations about the conversations that we had. You know what I'm saying? And I think that those are some of the things that when people ask you what you can do, I say, oh, you have to go back and talk to your people.
I think we're back to that conversation about shared responsibility, right? I mean, so I think it's a consistent conversation or point of our conversation, which is that so far, historically, it's felt that responsibility for the awkward conversation, for the tone policing, for the aesthetic representation, for the education, for the anti-racist practice has always been supposedly put on particular shoulders. And I mean, I guess if I'm at all hopeful, even as I sort of, complain gently about some of the work that I guess all of us are being asked to do right now, I'm also kind of hopeful based on it, because it seems like people are interested in taking on that responsibility. Whether they're going to or not, right, is potentially up for grabs. But I want to end with one last question for all of you around what makes you hopeful. And that doesn't have to be anything that we've even talked about right now. But I'm just kind of curious, like, what is the thing that's bringing you joy? What is the thing that's giving you hope? What's the thing that's pushing you forward in a way that you feel is quite positive? And you can go in any direction.
I will go back. I think Willie mentioned it. It's just having a group of people in my community that I can go back to. LaToya and I we speak pretty frequently, but just having that, knowing that there are people who have your back, who get you, who you can be authentically yourself with. I think that that's important, because there are days, and we talk about this, that we just go, I got to tap out. Like I cannot do this. I'll come back. I'm just going to go, we talk about self-care and taking care of ourselves so that we can be there for each other. And just having that, just having that community that says, yep, I'm here. Take all the time you need. How you doing? The check-ins, that's important. And I think that's what's gotten, that's all of the things that come out of that, that's the greatest thing that has come out of that, is that the community has kind of come together and I think built up some closeness, and that's been very gratifying, and I'm grateful for that.
Anyone else?
Yeah. I mean, I have an older sister who's a performer as well. And we've been working a lot together in regards to the kind of work that I've been talking about a little bit in this discussion. But it's funny because she has two little ones that are my niece and nephew, and I love them dearly. And we often have the conversation about, you know, the hopes of seeing, if that's what they decide to do, them on stage one day. My family is a very performative stage, off stage, like they're just very like artistic people that I love so dearly, and to be able to provide a space to see the future, be able to go to. I know that, you know, life isn't just some easy like little, you know, snap, and things are going to be different moving forward just because I want it to be, or after this conversation today. But that's kind of the driving force. One of the major driving forces for me too is the hope that the kind of work that is, and the discussions that are happening now will provide just a little bit easier of a path for them in the future, and for all of the future, you know? So, and I guess that's maybe the thing that provides me that kind of energy and that that mindset of like, all right, like this is the work that's worth it to me, because the bigger picture that I see, I believe can be possible. Mind you, I'm not always as hopeful every day, but that glimmer of that possibility kind of keeps me hopeful moving forward in this kind of work and in this time. So family, you know, community, unity within not only my personal family, but within the extension of my Black family and my BIPOC family, just getting to know them and to see them and to just be surrounded, even though it's via Zoom, most obviously during this time, but to be able to actually, like what Dee-Dee said, also to extend that kind of family like that provides me hopefulness, because we have a lot of times when we have discussions, they're not like this, where it's always so heavy and so, you know, grandiose, like just like humped over, you know. We have a lot of like funny times, and we laugh a lot together during this time. You know, we crack jokes with each other. We hold space for each other to talk, you know, and that gives me a lot of hope. So
I feel like one of the challenges when people ask that hope question, like what still gives you hope and stuff like that, is that like there's a desire that folks seem to have to want like to not have to hold the grief and not have to hold the sadness. And what it's become for me, I'm not a very hopeful person. Like I think the systems of racism that we're in are going to take like centuries longer to abolish, and it's going to be a continual work, and I don't expect to see a lot of change in my lifetime, frankly. But I feel like our communities have something that's stronger than having that hope that's just like that cookie at the end of the finish line, where, you know, we've survived a lot. And for me, it's been a matter of building the capacity to still have joy alongside all the other feelings and mix of stuff that I have. So still being able to, you know, take appreciation in the community of just being in the moment, even while we are collectively grieving like horrific things that are happening to our communities. So if that might be a little sad, but for me, that's the way to keep it most human, is like, having hope shouldn't mean disregarding like the collective difficulties and challenges that we're also facing right now.
Yeah, Willie, I'm gonna just jump right on the back of that. I'm also not a super hopeful person, but I also believe really strongly that like cynicism and nihilism is not a functional place. Like that's not useful to anything. That doesn't serve any purposes. That's just like me tapping out. And I would be remiss if I were to deny and disrespect and forget struggles that have happened in the past that have gotten me to this place, have given me this insight, you know, again, like reading things and researching and learning about myself. Like there's a wealth of knowledge. There's so much that has happened leading up to this. I think, you know, there's this quote that people like, you know, love to misquote MLK and say, but you said it, like the arc of the moral universe bends towards justice. And I think that what's important for me when I think about that is recognizing that that isn't just like some like evolutionary ethereal, this is hopeful at the end, we don't have to do work to get there. So I look to the future. If I'm going to be here, I better be doing something, in my opinion. And I'm not super hopeful. I think there's a lot of challenges that we have to face. I think we can rise to those challenges. I'm not sure if we will, but I don't think that it's responsible. And I also have a niece and nephew that I love so very much. And it would be, and all of my students, right? Like the youth that I work with, like it would be, and I relied on mentors and adults in my life to take care of me and get me to where I am. And so I have that responsibility to my community to show up and be doing the work as best as I can and to take care of myself so that I can take care of others.
Well, thank you all so much for your time, for your brilliance, your great comments, and your work and your art. I also say thank you to Felicia for this. This is fantastic. And to Ellen for writing a lot of these questions. And thank you all for showing up. And I'll just mute myself.
Thank you so much for all being here and giving your time and participating in the conversation. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.